about two major arguments for the existence of God, and tonight we're going to give the third argument, okay? Here are the arguments that we've covered already. We've covered what is known as the cosmological argument, the argument from the beginning of the universe. And we pointed out that there's scientific evidence that the universe exploded into being out of nothing. Once there was nothing, no time, no space, no matter, and then bang, everything leapt into existence. This is called the Big Bang. It leapt into existence out of nothing, no thing. There was nothing, and then the entire space-time continuum began. The scientific evidence is very strong that this is the case. Even Einstein's theory of general relativity shows that, okay? If it leapt into existence out of nothing, then there must be something outside the universe that brought it into existence. Something that's timeless because it created time. Something that's immaterial because it created material. Something that's powerful because it created out of nothing. Something that has no beginning because time itself was created. These are the attributes that we would call God. This thing leapt into, or the universe leapt into existence from an act of God. Then the next argument we covered was not only did the universe explode into being out of nothing, it did so with great precision. We talked about how incredibly designed the universe is and how incredibly designed you are. So if there's design in the universe and design in life, there must be a designer. And today, we're going to get to probably the argument that you can use more readily than any other. And it's called the moral argument from morality. We'll get into it in just a second. You may not remember all the scientific evidence we've been through already. Hopefully, you'll get the book and you'll be able to review it. You'll know a few of the things. But this argument, the moral argument, you can carry with you. Why? Because it's written on your heart. You can't not know this. You know that there's a sense of right and wrong written on your heart. And this argument leads right to the foot of the cross. Because if there is a standard of morality and we've all fallen short of that standard of morality, then the only way that we can be in the presence of an eternal being that is absolutely just is if somebody pays the price for the fact that we've fallen short. We can't pay the price. Once we've fallen short, there's nothing we can do to make up that gap. The only thing we can do is trust that somebody else has paid the price for us, and that's what Christianity is about. Jesus himself is the one that pays the price. God himself pays the price for us. So this argument leads right to the foot of the cross. Now let's talk about what the argument is. If there is no God, you can't say that this was really wrong. 9/11. Oh, you can say you didn't like it. You can say it was inconvenient. You can say it made you sad, but you can't say it's absolutely morally wrong. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond humanity, then it's just your opinion against bin Laden's opinion. If there's no objective standard beyond humanity, you can't say that 9/11 was really wrong. You can only say it's just your opinion. But we all intuitively know what? It was really wrong. It's absolutely morally wrong to fly planes into buildings with innocent people in them. We all know that. It's written on our hearts. So there has to be a God. If there's one thing morally wrong out there, there has to be a God. Absolutely morally wrong. Not just your opinion, it's wrong. You say, how do we know this? Well, let's talk about what the argument states. Here's what it states. Every law has a lawgiver. There is an absolute moral law, therefore there is an absolute moral lawgiver. Every prescription has a prescriber. If you go to the pharmacist someday with a prescription, the pharmacist looks at the prescription and looks at you and says, hey, who prescribed this? And you go, nobody. Are you going to get the prescription? No, he's going to say, wait a minute. Every prescription has a prescriber, and what we're saying right now is there is a moral law prescription written on the hearts of humanity. Humanity knows that there's a certain standard of rightness that they all ought to live up to. We know this. If there is that standard, then there's a God. All right, let's look at the evidence for how we know this. First of all, absolutes are undeniable. We know right from wrong best by our reactions, not our actions. If you want to know right from wrong, don't look at the way I treat you. because I do wrong all the time. If you want to know right from wrong, or what I think about right and wrong, look at how I react when you wrong me. Okay? For example, I may not think stealing is wrong when I steal from you, but what do I say the second you steal from me? Hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Right? Now, at the Harvest Conference, we were talking about this concept very briefly. And I brought up the issue of partial birth abortion. How many know what partial birth abortion is? Okay? That's where they take a full-term baby, 9 months in the womb. They take the baby almost completely out of the womb. The only thing left in the womb is the head. The doctor then takes a drill, drills a hole in the back of the baby's skull, and sucks the baby's brains out. Now, there are people in the United States Congress today who think this is a right. Most of them are Democrats. But there are some Republicans that believe this is a right. Now, when I was talking about this at the conference, I was standing right about here, and when I talked about drilling a hole in the back of somebody's skull as being wrong, I said, how could you show somebody that that's really wrong? And there was somebody way over there who said something that I didn't hear. And there was laughter from over there. And it was only after the session did someone come up to me and tell me what the guy said. Because I said, why is this funny? Why are people laughing over there? When I asked the question, how could you show somebody that drilling a hole in the back of a baby's skull is morally wrong, the guy in the corner said, drill a hole in the back of their skull. Think about it. That's right. Because as soon as you came at that guy with a drill, what would he do? Wait a minute, this is wrong. Okay? You know right from wrong by your reactions, not your actions. Let me give you another example of this. There was a professor teaching ethics at Purdue University a number of years ago. And he had a brilliant atheist in the class. And the professor said, you can write a paper on ethics, any topic you want. The only thing that I require is that the paper be no more than 20 pages. It has to be in my office by October 20th. It has to be properly footnoted, properly referenced. Any topic you want related to ethics. And this atheist wrote a paper as to why there is no absolute right and wrong. Why it's all a matter of opinion. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. Relativism is true, in other words. And he handed it in on time. It was the right length. It was properly footnoted, properly referenced, and he gave it to the professor in a handsome blue folder. The professor got the paper, he opened it up, he started reading. There is no absolute right and wrong, there is no justice, it's all a matter of opinion. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. Relativism is true. The professor closed the paper up. On the top of it, he wrote F. I don't like blue folders. Next class, the professor gave the paper back to the atheist. He looked at the paper, which was the right length, in at the right time, properly footnoted, properly referenced, very neat, on a topic related to ethics, and on the front of it, it said, F, I don't like blue folders. After class, he stormed up to the professor. He handed the professor the paper. He said, F, I don't like blue folders. That is not fair. That is not right. That is not just. The professor said, wait. I read a lot of papers here. Let me make sure I understand your paper. Isn't your paper the one that says there is no such thing as fairness, there is no such thing as rightness, there is no such thing as justice, it's all a matter of opinion, you like chocolate, I like vanilla? The student said, yeah, that's my view. The professor said, I don't like blue. You get an F. Suddenly the light bulb went off in the student's head. Why? Because he realized that he was judging the professor wrong, absolutely, for judging the paper based on the color of the folder. And you know what? He was right about that. You shouldn't judge the paper on the color of the folder. So after the student learned his lesson, the professor took the paper back and said, you learned your lesson now? And he gave him an A. He said, even though the content is wrong, you did the assignment, now you've learned your lesson. There is a real standard of right and wrong, and you know it by your reactions when I grade your paper as an F for having the color blue. Secondly, we can't know injustice unless we know justice. How how many of you, this goes back a little ways, but there was a debate between Alan Keyes and Alan Dershowitz. This debate probably back in the early, like 2000, 2001, okay? And the debate was on the role of religion in the public square. You know, the whole separation of church and state thing, right? And both of these guys are very articulate. Alan Keyes is a Catholic, and Alan Dershowitz is a Jewish atheist agnostic. He doesn't know if there's a God or not, right? But he leans that there isn't. And what happened was, there was a question from the audience after Dershowitz had gone on and on and on about how the Holocaust was wrong, how prohibiting abortion was wrong, how prohibiting same-sex marriage was wrong. He kept going on and on and on about how many things were wrong in society. And then a question came from the audience. Very simple question, one of the first questions asked. Said, this is a question for Mr. Dershowitz. How do you know what is right? And Dershowitz said, that is a great question. That is a fantastic question. And then he went on to say, I don't know what's right, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure it out. But I can tell you this, those of you out there who think you know what's right, as soon as you think you know what's right, you've lost the ability to learn. You've lost the ability to grow. So don't think you know what's right. I don't know what's right, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to find out. And that was it. Now, what's the problem with the statement? What's the problem? Didn't Dershowitz say the Holocaust was wrong? Didn't he say that prohibiting abortion was wrong? Didn't he say that prohibiting same-sex marriage was wrong? How can you know what is wrong unless you know what is right? You can't know what is not right unless you know what is right. So Dershowitz completely was befuddled by the question, even though all the things he kept talking about implied he knew what was right. Now, unfortunately, Keyes could have said, which he didn't, he could have said, how can he know what is absolutely unjust without knowing what is absolutely just? And this is one of the arguments the atheist brings up. The atheist brings up the fact that this can't be, or there can't be an all-good God if there's so much injustice in the world. In other words, there's evil in the world. So how can there be a good God? How can there be a good God if there's all this evil? This is what C.S. Lewis thought for many years. He said, there can't be a good God with all this evil. You know what conclusion he ultimately came to? Here's what C.S. Lewis said, and he wrote this in Mere Christianity. He said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You can't know injustice or injustice unless you know justice, right? And you can't know justice unless there's a God whose very nature is the standard of justice. So the argument against God by the atheist actually backfires. They're assuming there's a standard of justice to say this world is evil. And in a few minutes we're going to talk about one of the atheists that's out there right now called Christopher Hitchens. Have you heard of him? The book God is Not Great. His book and also Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, are books that try and tell us that Christianity is false or wrong because it's immoral, because so many people have done immoral things in the name of religion. Well, wait a minute. How can there be any immorality unless there's a God by which to define what morality is? That's just your opinion that Christianity is cruel, or Christian history has been wronged, or has been wrong for doing many of the things Christians have done. If there's no God, you have no grounds to object to that. We'll see that in just a minute. Next point, real moral disagreements imply an objective moral standard. If there is no objective moral standard, you can't say Mother Teresa was better than Hitler. You can't. In fact, Let's ask the question, how do you know who's right and who's wrong, Mother Teresa or Hitler? How do you know? Because of their actions. Right. You say Mother Teresa loved people and Hitler killed them. But how do you know it's right to love and wrong to kill? That's the question, right? Let's look at it a different way. How do you know which map of Scotland is better? Map A or map B? What's the only way you could know? You would have to see what? A real unchanging place called Scotland. And when you see that real unchanging place called Scotland, you can see that map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the real Scotland than is map B. If Scotland does not exist, those two maps are meaningless, right? But since Scotland exists, we can see which map is closer. That's exactly what we do when we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa isn't the standard of good, neither is Hitler. There's a standard outside of them by which we measure both of them. And we say Mother Teresa, while she wasn't perfect, lived up to the standard of rightness or goodness better than did Hitler. Now, what is this standard of rightness or goodness? This standard of rightness or goodness is God's very nature. It's unchanging. He is the standard of rightness. And in fact, this is how our country began. Thomas Jefferson wrote what? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know a standard of rightness is written on your heart. It's called conscience. In the Declaration of Independence, they called it nature's law. It's God's very nature written on humanity. You know it, it's intuitive to you, and it was put there by God. And the rights that you have come from God. The Declaration goes on to say that governments don't give you rights, governments don't take away your rights, government protect your rights. That's what governments do. They protect the rights you already have. They don't grant them nor take them away. All right. Point 4, how do we know there's an objective moral law? We wouldn't make excuses for doing wrong if there was no moral law. You ever notice when you do something wrong, you immediately start making excuses? You ever notice that? Like when you're caught in a lie, you go, well, gee, I didn't, I'm sorry, but, it's never like, what's wrong with lying? You don't say that. Right? You don't say, yeah, I lied, so what? Or, yeah, I stole your stuff, so? You don't say that, do you? You always come up with excuses. Why do you come up with excuses? Because you know you're not living up to the standard you ought to be living up to. Once again, nobody's written better on this than C.S. Lewis. Here's what Lewis wrote. He said, it seems then that we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. Second, they do not, in fact, behave in that way. The truth is we believe in decency so much that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it, and consequently we try to shift the responsibility. Don't we? That is powerful, man. If you haven't read Mere Christianity, consider yourself uneducated. Go out and get Mere Christianity. These are all quotes from Mere Christianity. How many have read that? C.S. Lewis. You've got to read Mere Christianity, particularly part 1. Mere meaning these are the basics of Christianity. And his entire argument in the first part of the book is one of the ways we know God exists is the moral law. It's written on your heart. You can't get around it. And those who claim there isn't a God claim that they have certain rights. Well, where do these rights come from? They borrow from the Christian worldview in order to say atheism is true, or in order to live their life as atheists. Point 5, we wouldn't know the world was getting worse or better if there was no moral law. Usually, political liberals will say the world is getting better, and political conservatives will say the world is getting worse. Well, you couldn't know one or the other unless you had a standard by which to judge. You don't know whether something's better unless you know what is best, right? You don't know whether something's worse unless, again, you know a standard, what is best, and you're moving away from that standard. So you can't know whether we're getting better or worse unless there's a moral standard by which to measure that. All right, we got to make some clarifications here, because when you go and talk about this kind of thing, atheists will object. So let me draw some clarifications here as to what we are not saying and what we are saying. We are not saying atheists can't be moral. They can. Many atheists are moral citizens. okay? That's not the point here. We are not saying that atheists don't know morality. They do. They have it written on their hearts just like we do. You don't need to believe in God to know right from wrong. You simply can't justify morality. This is what we are saying. You can't justify right and wrong unless there's a God. And this is what atheists do. They tend to borrow from the Christian worldview and pull it into their worldview and then try and argue against the Christian worldview by using the very moral law that they say doesn't exist. Let's be more specific. Atheists can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism provides no objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. You see, what atheists will try and do is they'll try to say, well, you know morality because of Darwinism. You know, morality evolved, and you learned it from your parents, and they learned it from their parents, and from their parents, and it just kind of got passed down to you through this process of natural selection. We arrived at morality through biology, basically, just like everything else. Now, even if you were to say that's true, which it isn't, but even if you were to grant them that doesn't explain why murder is wrong. That might explain why you think murder is wrong, but is murder wrong independent of what you think about it? Suppose somebody evolves to think murder isn't wrong. Is murder really wrong or not? Right? See, this is, and I don't mean to be too technical here, but you guys can handle it. This is the difference philosophers talk about when they're drawing a distinction between epistemology and ontology. This is a critical distinction. Epistemology is how we know something, right? Ontology is that something is. All right? So, for example, I may have learned the times tables from my first grade teacher, Miss Santinello. Right? That's how I learned the times tables. But the fact that 2 times 2 equals 4 is ontology. That's just the way things are. How I came to know that, well, people taught me that, right? And what atheists do is they confuse those two things. They confuse epistemology and ontology, and they object when they say, well, we know right from wrong, and we can be moral. Yeah, you can. That's not the point. The point isn't how you know it. The point is that it exists. How is there a standard of rightness if there is no God? If we are just all elements on the periodic table. See, because that's what atheists believe. They're materialists. That the only thing that you are comprised of are elements on the periodic table. That's the only thing that exists. The only thing that exists are physical things, right? Well, if the only thing that exists are physical things, elements on the periodic table, how can murder be wrong? You're just killing a conglomeration of elements on a periodic table. How is that wrong? It's not. And you can't, using the atheist worldview, you can't say anything's wrong and you ought not put anyone in jail. Why? Because they didn't really do it because they don't have free will. It's just chemical reactions going on in their brain. Right? So you might as well just ask, in the atheist materialist worldview, you might ask an atheist, was Hitler really wrong? Or did Hitler just have bad molecules? Right? You might ask them. If only thing that exists is material, just stuff on a periodic table now, where does morality come from? Morality is an immaterial entity, right? Where do the laws of logic come from? You have access to them, I have access to them, but they're not material. You know, you can't find them in your desk drawer. They're just out there. Where does love come from? Is love just a chemical reaction? Many in our society think so, don't they? It's just a chemical reaction. Is that it? What does love weigh? Ask him that. What does hate weigh? What do the laws of logic weigh? If everything must be on the periodic table, if all we are elements, dirt, if that's all we are, how can these other things like logic, morality, the laws of mathematics, love, how can these things exist? They can't exist in that worldview, so atheists borrow from the Christian worldview. They can't justify where these things come from, but they know they exist. Now let's talk about this book for a second. How many have read this book, God is Not Great? Anyone read the book? Anyone know who I'm talking about? Christopher Hitchens. You may have seen him on TV. I like Christopher Hitchens. You've ever seen him? He is witty. He's articulate. He speaks quickly. He's acerbic. It's almost like he's from Jersey, you know? But he's not. He's from England. He's British. And he wrote the book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Okay? Now, here's one of the problems. Religion does not poison everything. In fact, one of the premises of his book, or one of the things he goes into in the book is, how many religious people have done evil things, right? And religion just causes trouble, in other words. I'm here to say religion does not poison everything. Everything poisons religion. That's really what's going on. You know what poisons religion? We do. We poison the words of Christ because we don't live them. We poison religion by being greedy, by being selfish, by being depraved, by doing all the things we ought not do. And by the way, the very reason we do those things, or the very fact that we do those things, is why Christ came. Of course, you should expect to find fallen people that say they're Christians. If there were no fallen people who were Christians, Christ wouldn't have had to have come, right? So we poison the words of Christ. We poison what he came to do and the standard that he gave us to live by. We mess it up. That's true. But it's not religion that's the problem. We're the problem. We need to admit that. Of course, he overlooks, too, in the book, he overlooks that there's a lot of good things that religious people do. He just looks at the evil things that many have done and do today. It's not just Christianity. He goes after Islam. And maybe for good reason, if you look at some of the things in the name of Islam that are going on, right? So let's clarify a couple things. We agree with atheists. First of all, some atheists live better moral lives than some Christians. That's true. We need to admit that, right? We also must agree with them that some who say they're church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ. Church history has often been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil. We got to admit that. There have been things that have gone on in the name of Christ that Christ never would have condoned. But as Augustine said years ago, you never judge a philosophy by its abuse. You never judge a philosophy by its abuse. Of course, many people who say they're Christians have done evil things. Maybe they were Christians, but maybe they weren't. Right? Jesus said, many, many will come saying that I am the Christ, but will go on and deceive many. In other words, many will admit that Jesus is the Christ. But then they go on to deceive many. Many, he said, will come at the final day saying, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these things in your name? And what does he say to them? Depart from me, I never knew you. Yeah, there are many people who say they're sheep, but they're really wolves. Okay? So we must agree that church people have done evil things. We don't dispute that. But that doesn't make Christianity false. In fact, we could turn it on the atheist, and we ought to turn it on the atheist. You know, more people have been killed in the name of atheism in the 20th century than were killed in all the previous centuries combined by religious people. You think about what's going on in the 20th century. Think about Stalin. Think about Hitler. Think about Mao. Combined, they've killed something like 60 million people. All in the name of atheism. Now, Hitler didn't officially say he was an atheist, but he certainly believed in evolution and Darwinism. In fact, in Mein Kampf, his book, 1924, he said something like, the weaker race has no right to survive. I can't remember the quote exactly, but he went on to basically say, if we want to eradicate the weaker race for a greater good, we will. And that's what he went on to do. See, nobody believed Hitler in 1924. He wasn't going to do these things, and what did he go on doing? He went on and did them, trying to create the uber race, the super race. So atheist, the logical outworking of atheism is the Holocaust. Why not kill 6 million Jews to get what you want? There's nothing morally wrong with anything. If it'll bring you gratification, go right ahead. But the illogical outworking of Christianity is some of the things that Christians have done, like the Crusades, where they tried to force people to believe. You can't force people to believe, and then they killed people. You can't do that. It's a free will choice. So let's clarify. We agree with the atheists. We are only saying when they go on to say that church history, and we agree with them, has been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil, we are saying there is no moral or immoral, just or unjust, or good or evil unless God exists. So again, you're using the moral argument against Christianity when the only way the moral argument could exist is if the God of Christianity exists. Now, what about moral dilemmas? We need to park right here for just a minute. Moral dilemmas. How many have been to college already? Did your ethics professor in college ever give you the old moral dilemma deal? You know what the moral dilemma is? Well, you got a life raft. You got 4 people on it. It's only designed to hold 3. You only have food for 3. If you don't throw somebody off, everyone will die. Why don't you guys break into groups, discuss it, come back in about 20 minutes, and we'll see what kind of conclusion you come up with. Well, what do you think happens? All these different groups come up with different answers. And what's the conclusion the professor draws? What's the conclusion? Well, there is no real right and wrong. It's all relative. This group came up with this group came up with that, this group came up with another thing, this group came up with still another solution. Some groups are going, we don't know what to do. So that's it, morality's relative. Is that really it? First of all, let me give you a little Gary Larson here. Here's what Gary Larson says. Fair is fair there, Fred. We're out of food. We drew straws and you lost. I don't know if you can see that. They're not going to throw the dog over. They're going to throw Fred over. But anyway, let's go back to the dilemma for a second. Why is it that you are in a dilemma? Why is this a difficult moral problem? Why is it? Anyone? Because no matter what, somebody has to die. That's right, Matt. And what's the problem with somebody dying? It's wrong to kill, right? Now, think about that. The very reason you're having a dilemma is because you know how valuable life is. If life wasn't valuable, you'd say, throw everybody off. Who cares? You're just elements on the periodic table. Who cares, right? The very reason you're having a dilemma is because you know life is valuable. So the dilemma does not prove that morality is relative. It only proves we live in a fallen world, and sometimes you're going to have conflicting absolutes. That happens. Okay? But if morality was completely relative, you wouldn't have the dilemma. The very reason you're struggling is because you know how valuable life is. Now, what's the right answer? I don't know what the right answer is. But that doesn't mean there's no answer, A, and B, that doesn't mean that morality is relative. Morality is absolute, and that's why when we think about moral issues, we have to think in terms of this hierarchy. There is a hierarchy to God, then people, then things. That's why the Gary Larson thing there is funny, because they're inverting the moral hierarchy. They're throwing a human off instead of a dog. Now, in our culture, we care more about puppies than we do about babies. Isn't that amazing? In fact, I don't know why people are getting all upset with Michael Vick. Think about it. Those were his dogs on his property. If he wanted to kill them, why not? He owned them, right? Is there any difference between that and the argument pro-abortion people give for abortion? There's no difference, right? That's her property, her baby. She wants to kill it. Why not? We're more outraged over Michael Vick killing pit bulls than we are people killing little babies. Think about that. A friend of mine is D.L. Hughley. I don't know if you know who that is, but he and I were on Politically Incorrect once together, so we kind of struck up a friendship. And I was talking to him a couple weeks ago, and he said, I can't believe Michael Vick is killing dogs because they lost. And he plays for the Falcons. I mean, think about that. He'd have to kill all his teammates after every game if he was consistent. We got to keep this hierarchy in mind. God, people, and things. Now, that doesn't mean we won't run into moral issues or moral dilemmas. We will. In ethics, this is called graded absolutism, that there are certain things that are more absolute in terms of your duty than others, right? For example, and Christians disagree on this, but I'll give you my view. Suppose you're in Nazi Germany and you're hiding Jews in your attic, and one day you hear a knock on the door. Schnell! Kommen Sie hier! Hast du Juden hier? You supposed to tell the truth to the Nazi? Or do you lie to protect the Jews in your attic? Well, you're supposed to always tell the truth, right? Thou shalt not bear false witness. But if you lie, what happens to the Jews? So what do you do? Christians disagree, but I say you lie. Why? Because you have a higher duty to protect life than to tell truth to a murderer. Now, we got to be careful with this because we can rationalize a whole bunch of things in our mind, right? I lied to protect myself because, you can see where that goes, okay? But in an extreme situation like that, you can understand what the right thing to do is, okay? So when we say there is a moral law, we are saying there are certain things everybody intuitively understands that are right and certain things that are wrong. God has implanted that on your heart. They're based on His very nature. We're not saying every moral issue is easy. We're not saying that. We're saying on the big issues, everybody knows it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to lie. We know that. It's wrong to rape. But when you're struck with a situation like the Nazis, you have a greater duty to protect life than you do to tell a murderer the truth. All right, so from these three arguments now, we've got the three arguments: the beginning argument, cosmological argument, design argument, teleological argument, and the moral argument from morality. We can draw some conclusions, okay? We can draw some conclusions. Here are the conclusions we can draw. From these three arguments, we know the first cause, the cosmological argument, we know that this first cause is self-existing, immaterial, and eternal outside the universe. Why? Because He created material, He created time, He's outside the universe, and He must be self-existing because you can't create yourself. Every finite thing was created at the Big Bang, so He must be infinite. We also know that He's infinitely powerful because He created out of nothing. That's from the cosmological argument. Now, from the teleological argument, we know He's infinitely intelligent. We also know He has purpose. You say, well, wait, how do we know this is one God? Why couldn't many gods have done this? There's a number of answers to this, but let me give you one of them. Because with the extreme precision in the universe and the extreme precision in you, we know this is the product of one mind, not many. Okay? This was coordinated by one mind, not many. From the moral argument, we know He's absolutely morally perfect and we also know he's personal. You can't have a moral obligation to an impersonal force. You don't have a moral obligation to gravity. You only have a moral obligation to persons. We also know that he's personal because he made a choice to go from non-creation, nothing, to creation. The only way that you can do that is to make a choice. Gravity doesn't make choices. Gravity just does what it does. It doesn't decide when I drop this remote that it's going to take it to the ground. It just does it automatically, right? It makes no choices. To go from a state of non-existence, nothing, before there was ever a creation, to go to a state of creation required a choice, which means the being that brought it into existence is personal. You with me? Now, this is the God of biblical Christianity identified without reference to the Bible. Notice that we've got the attributes of God by looking at just those three arguments. The cosmological argument, teleological argument, and moral argument. We get these attributes. And those attributes are the same attributes the Bible applies to God. Our only question now is, which theism is true? At this point, we can say that pantheism and atheism can't be true. Why? Because we've given evidence that there's a God beyond the world who created the world and sustains the world. So theism must be true. The question is, which theism? But before we do, let's point out here are the world religions that cannot be true. If our reasoning is right so far, right? These world religions can't be true. Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, secular humanism, Mormonism, polytheism, Wiccan, Confucianism, Taoism. Why? Because they're all non-theistic. Now, I'm not saying that everything that these religions on the right teach is wrong. Most world religions have some truth in them. I'm simply saying on the issue of God, they're wrong because they don't have a God that the cosmological, teleological, and moral argument show us exists. All right? Now, a lot of people ask the question, why is Mormonism up there? Isn't that just another brand of Christianity? Is it? One of the doctrines of Mormonism is, as man is, God once was. What does that mean? It means that God was once a man, and there are many gods. And that you, if you're a Mormon, ultimately you will become a god and get your own planet. I'm not making this up. This is Mormon doctrine. Mormons are polytheists. Doesn't mean they're not nice people. Doesn't mean they don't make good neighbors. Doesn't mean they don't teach some things that are true. But at the core, they're polytheists. They're not theists. I had a conversation once with a Mormon over dinner, and I gave him the cosmological argument. I said, this universe sprang into existence out of nothing. I said, how do you guys deal with that? He goes, oh, we don't go back that far. You don't go back that far? What do you mean? So the only question now is, which of these which of these major theistic world religions is true? Is it Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Which is it? Thanks, Christianity. Okay, let's go. We're done. Good answer. You're reading ahead. Well, how could we figure out which one of these is true? Huh? What it was founded on, this is true. And what could God do that only He could do to get our attention, to tell us, look, if it is Christianity, it's not Islam, it's Christianity. How could He get our attention? What could He do that only He could do? Resurrection, somebody said it, which is, in a broader sense, miracles, right? Miracles. He could do a miracle to authenticate that, say, Moses speaks for Him. Or He could do a miracle to authenticate that, say, Jesus speaks for Him, or the apostles speak for Him, right? The miracle confirms the message, the sign confirms the sermon. And what we're going to do next time is miracles. Now, I'm not going to do miracles, but we will cover miracles, okay? I'll leave miracles for somebody else. But with that, we've got the three major arguments for the existence of God. Let me point out one thing before I take any questions you might have. The moral argument we talked about tonight is a critical argument. It's a critical argument because people have it written on their hearts. And you can ping their conscience by pointing out that they're not living up to the standard they know they ought to be living up to. A lot of times we evangelize the wrong way. Why? Well, we go to people and we try and tell them that God has a wonderful plan for your life. That might be true, but if I don't have a problem, I'm not looking for a solution, right? You ever see those bumper stickers that say Jesus is the answer? My question is, what's the question? Jesus is the answer to what? You've got to show people that they're sinful before they're looking for a solution. Suppose I were to say to you, I've spent my life savings. This is an illustration from Ray Comfort. I don't know if you know who Ray Comfort is, but he does a lot of evangelism, and he gets these great tracts. And anyway, wayofthemaster.com. You can learn more about Ray Comfort. His illustration is this. Suppose I were to tell you that I spent my entire life savings trying to find the cure for Crohn's disease, say, for example. And you're looking at me going, you're an idiot. Why'd you do that? But what if I come to you and I say, you have Crohn's disease. Well, let's just assume for a second it's fatal. This disease is fatal, okay? This disease will kill you in 6 months. You don't have much time left. Now, suddenly, I've got your attention, right? You've got this disease. But then I say, but I've spent my entire life savings to find a cure, and I found it. Now, suddenly, you want what? You're interested and you want the cure, right? So we've got to give people the bad news before we give them the good news. We've got to show people that they've fallen short of the standard. That's what the moral argument helps us do, before we try and give them the solution. There is no solution if they don't think there's a problem. If they think they're a pretty good person, right? And they're going to get to heaven by just because they're a good person and God just looks favorably on them. They don't need the gospel. They don't think they need the gospel. You've got to show them, no, you're not living up to the standard. You ask them, have you ever lied? Just one little lie. Yeah. What does that make you? A liar. Have you ever stolen anything? Just a little thing. Yeah. What does that make you? A thief. So you're a lying thief already. What's going to happen on Judgment Day? If you're not covered in the blood of Christ, His righteousness, then God can't allow a sinful person into His heaven. You've chosen your own destiny, and that's separation from Him forever. The only solution is somebody who's found the cure. Jesus. He is the cure. That's why He's the answer. All right. Any questions? Anything we've covered tonight?
I couldn't do it. I could not do it.
Yeah, you can't do it.
But here,
yeah,
in my spirit, man,
right.
I began to understand.
You can't live the Christian life. It's impossible, right? Certainly not by your own power. But even with God's power, and when we get into Romans, we're going to talk about this process of sanctification, which Paul talks about in the middle chapters of the book of Romans. Hopefully through the Spirit we are continually improving our moral behavior, but we have ups and downs, don't we? We have all the Holy Spirit. He just doesn't have all of us. Right? We're the ones that poison religion. He doesn't do it. We do it. So we can't live the Christian life without Christ, and even with Him, we're still fallen, and we still make mistakes, and we're still sinful. So we're going to talk later about the incarnation and how that relates to the Trinity. We'll save that question for a little bit later. Go ahead, Leonard.
Does that mean in the flesh, incarnate?
Yeah, incarnate. Christ came and put humanity over His deity. Incarnate. He came and lived as a man. Now, the great theologian Athanasius, one of the early church fathers, maybe from about the 3rd century or so, said that, or the 4th century, I can't remember which, he said, the incarnation was not the subtraction of deity, it was the addition of humanity. Okay? Jesus put humanity over His deity, and He had 2 natures. So we'll talk more about this when we get into the New Testament in a couple weeks or 3 weeks, whenever we get there. We get into the New Testament, we're going to talk about what the Trinity means and how when you ask a question about Jesus, you really have to ask two questions, because you have to ask a question about his divine nature and his human nature. Okay? Anybody else? Okay, did Jesus have a human nature apart from an Adamic nature? Yes, in the sense he did not have original sin. That's why the virgin birth is so important. It's not just another miracle. The virgin birth, it really wasn't a virgin birth. He came out just like everybody else. It was a virgin conception. Okay? The virgin conception was so important because he did not inherit the sin nature of Adam. He had a perfect nature. Maybe the fallen nature of Adam, maybe he had the nature of Adam before he fell, okay? Could Jesus have sinned? Yes, but did he? No. But he did not have the sin nature, and that's why he's the perfect sacrifice for us. You know, he was the perfect lamb, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. He was unblemished by sin. Yes, over there. Okay, yeah, the question is, how does everything being so precise that this shows that there's only one God? Because this seems to be the product of one divine mind rather than many. Because everything is so precisely tweaked. An illustration I gave a couple weeks ago was if we had a tape measure running along this auditorium here, and we set gravity right here. If we moved gravity an inch, regardless of what the scale is here, or what the units on gravity are, but if we moved it an inch, life would go out of existence. We wouldn't even be here. But I said that the scale is not as long as this auditorium. The scale is as long as the entire universe. And if we move gravity on that scale of the entire universe 1 inch, life doesn't exist. That particular characteristic about the universe had to be balanced with a number of other characteristics about the universe which appear to make it the product of one single mind, not many minds. Also, there's another more philosophical answer to that. If God is infinite, and we believe he is because he created all finite things, then you can't have two infinite beings, can you? Because another being that was also infinite would be the same being as the first being, because they didn't lack anything. So you can't have two infinite beings. To have two beings, one has to not have what the other one has. There has to be some distinction between them. But if this one is infinite and this one is infinite, they don't lack anything, so they're the same being. I know this can give you intellectual constipation, okay? But the point is one infinite. There can only be one infinite being. You can't have many gods. You can have other spiritual beings that are not infinite, like angels and demons, right? We believe that, but there has to be one infinite creator. All right, why don't we close in prayer? And as we do, think about this week how you can use something we talked about this week to either witness to somebody or to encourage somebody who's already a Christian, all right? Father, we thank you for the opportunity to come and to discuss the moral law that you've put on our hearts. We know that you've put it there, so we'd be reminded that you are a moral being, a holy being, who cannot look on evil with favorability. And we know that the only way that we can be reconciled to you is through the perfect, sinless sacrifice that you, through your Son, provided for us. We pray now that you would help us this week to be mindful of what we've learned, what we've talked about here, so we could go out and do the work of ministry. Ephesians 4 says, let's go out and do the work of ministry. We need to equip the saints to go out and do ministry. I pray that we've been equipped tonight to go out and do ministry. In Christ's name, amen.